Good morning again, friends. We are trying to break the record by starting 2 minutes before time instead of after time, which I think is a good idea, so that we do away with the stereotypes that when people are late, it's called African time. There's nothing like that. It's just people being delayed. Thank you so much. We welcome a friend, a brother, and a colleague who is going to speak to us, Dr. Stephan. I want to say that I came to know him some many moons ago, over 20 years in Pretoria, when he was still running the inner city project, which was very powerful, and also involved in the leadership of Institute for Urban Mission. In fact, he introduced me to Urban Mission, and then enjoyed working with him. In fact, he was a co-supervisor for my master's at the time, which was on mission and urban development. Very committed and passionate person. Dr. Dibie is from the University of Pretoria. I really was not sure when I heard that he'd been appointed there that he was going to cycle in the academy for more than 2 years. Because for me, he was just this inner city activist, excited, doing good work there. But well, people surprise us. He's still there as an academic. Boring as it is, he's still doing it, which is wonderful. It's so good to have you, Stephan. Please, he's going to talk to us by doing praxis-based theologies of radical citizenship in South Africa today. Over to you. Let's welcome him with a warm applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Samanga, for your intro, and it's great to I feel honored to be in a space with you. Thank you also for asking me to speak in this space. I must say it's long since I felt this intimidated, being with all the gurus of the discipline. That's not why I ran away. I am really apologizing that I'm not there. I really looked forward to the time in Bloemfontein, but I had a crisis with my daughter, and I wanted to be with her yesterday. So I will humbly share what I've prepared. The title of my talk, Doing Praxis-Based Theologies of Radical Citizenship in South Africa Today. And apologies if I rush it a bit because I want to stay in time. I just want to be sure I can show my own. Sorry, Sean, I just have a problem. I can't. Okay, there it is. Citizenship, responsibility, decency are not unproblematic concepts, all laden, employed since ancient times and also by colonial forces to differentiate insider, outsider, to institutionalize exclusion, to normalize the other. These terms have clustered women, children, slaves, and barbarians together, either relegating them to the household, where they are absent from the shaping of the police, or assigning them to spaces outside the cityscape. In contemporary South African cities, these terms, I sense, often also reek of middle-class suburban sensibilities, far removed from the indecent spaces of Africa's urban slums, left to their own devices by the trinity of colonial vestiges, corrupt governments, and new liberal capital dictates. Seeking cohesion through social control instead of social justice, citizenship has always been a binary concept from Athens to Joburg, subduing the oikos to the police. Pan-African visions and rhetoric retrieved when political convenient give way to binaries that turn fellow humans into aliens when that seems more politically convenient. The waste picker has become a feature of today's South African urban landscape, and where I live, I notice a subtle shift from animosity to affirmation. Is this person in the image South African or not? Is he a citizen in legal sense, a documented immigrant or undocumented worker? In speaking about this person and this image to Klippie Skritzinger, his immediate response was, is he not exemplary of responsible citizenship, cleaning up the excesses of our wasteful culture and, according to the CSIR, saving our cities millions of rands every year? Yet, in official discourse, waste speakers remain a thorn in the flesh of policymakers, too often still criminalized by law enforcement agencies and under constant surveillance of neighborhood watchers. And yet I would like to offer this image as a visual clue for reimagined citizenship. I would try to unpack such a reimagined radical notion of citizenship with reference to the notions of non-citizen citizenship, detaching state from nation, the new political community, new social movements, and finally, Russell's household of freedom. I speak of becoming citizens as a verb, not a static legal concept. It seems to me there could be different processes of becoming citizen, through naturalization or normalization into legal citizenship of a nation state, whatever form that might take, through the subversive actions of so-called non-citizen citizens, living their lives in foreign spaces, much like God's exiled people in Jeremiah, building houses, planting gardens in a city not their own, or through learning how to be citizens in an active sense, implying that legal citizenship does not necessarily mean active citizenry, but that the art of citizenship might have to be learned, both by so-called legal as well as non-citizen citizens. In apartheid South Africa, those with the most entrenched citizens' rights seldom had to learn the art of citizenship because of our privilege. Yet in informal settlements, rural villages, vast townships, and later many inner city neighborhoods, not protected by the privileges of capital, law enforcement, pigmentation, and entrenched rights, daily existence was often a matter of life and death, and in these spaces, as a matter of survival, people had to develop citizens' agency. Can you hear me? Just one person left. Let me carry on. A striking post-apartheid, post-colonial instance in my mind is the town of Harrismith in the Free State Province. I recently drove into the town early evening and could not find where I wanted to go because not one street light worked. The town looked strangely abandoned and not at all what I recalled from my last and only other visit. I looked for clues to explain my intrigue and had to discover, what many of you might know, that the municipal infrastructure and finance of Harrismith, which forms part of the Maluti Apofung municipality, completely collapsed as a result of poor governance and corruption. Only 33% of the population has access to sewage and sanitation. Official water purification processes do not exist, and raw sewage ran into the Wilge River, contaminating the town's water supply. The road infrastructure collapsed, waste removal was discontinued. In came the water heroes of Harrismith, as they were called. A couple of black township leaders and white farmers discovered each other, both affected by the worsening conditions of the town. Karim writes, the water heroes rallied their neighbors, friends, family, and proactive community members to take charge and pay for essential service delivery from their own pockets. They raised millions themselves to fix the water purification system, fix the potholes, start removal of waste on the streets, all along facing obstruction from municipal officials who themselves showed no interest to fix the problem. I read this as a post-apartheid instance of de-racialized radical citizenship from within a community. In last year's local government elections, 4 of the water heroes made themselves available as local candidates. I offer the idea of citizenship as the process of becoming post-colonial, post-apartheid, post-Christendom household of freedom, not beholden to colonial constructs of citizen and subject, master, slave, settler, native, not defined by apartheid's racialized segregationist constructs, reproduced today, and refusing to participate in the complicity of Christian mission in the nation state, xenophobic rhetoric and facades of decency, instead becoming and learning how to share life as citizens in a new household of freedom. Letty Russell contrasts the police of the city-state, the domain of white, propertied, free men, with the household or oikos occupied by women, children, or slaves. In the ancient Greek cities, such patriarchal divisions are often starkly reinforced, condemning, in Russell's word, the oikos to be a household of bondage and making the police a false democracy based on oppression of the families and workforces of society. The nation-state and its cities reproduce the same today, also in post-apartheid cities. In response, Russell reappropriates the idea of household, proposing the kingdom of God as a household of freedom, subverting top-down models of exclusivist and oppressive forms of power, replacing such with partnership models in which power is practiced collaboratively as practices of freedom. She insists that the new household of freedom should break into both private and public spaces, subverting the police from within. She considers the household of freedom as a new kind of authority that, in her words, belongs to God, the housekeeper of all creation, and stands in direct opposition to the old house of patriarchal bondage made undone in the suffering Christ. Instead of responsible citizenship, making sure we stay on the side of the law, voting every few years, paying taxes, accepting rather uncritically the falsity of democracy, radical citizenship wants to extend itself deeper and wider in critical, constructive manner. Let me start with some thoughts on alternative imaginaries of citizenship. Narrowly defined, citizenship refers to legal or political membership of a state. And in the process, millions are excluded or exploited as subjects of states they do not belong to. Non-citizens can only become citizens in the narrow definitions of nation-state through being normalized or sanitized into the virtues of pseudo-democracies: docility, responsibility, decency. The idea of participatory citizenship, Andrew Davies says, can feel as remote for residents of the global city as it was for the slaves and women in classical Athens. What is urgently needed are new imaginaries of citizenship, and I want to draw from a number of alternative imaginaries. The non-citizen citizen. When I speak of becoming citizens or citizenship as verb, I think of it in the sense that Charles Lee describes it as social action and belonging, with people claiming their right to participate in the evolving police. Instead of the exclusionary binary nature in which citizenship is mostly framed, I offer the denizen, the strange outsider, as metaphor for a reimagined concept of citizen. Lee speaks of how undocumented workers in the US is regarded in dominant discourse as people taking advantage of the American dream whilst not contributing in return. But Lee, to the contrary, asserts that undocumented and documented migrants, I quote him, are the most innovative role models exemplifying what it means to be full-on engaged citizens of a democratic community. Jennifer Gordon documents the visible public practices of undocumented immigrants to attain citizens and workers' rights, and she coins it non-citizen citizenship. And Charles Lee then goes further, suggesting that such non-citizen citizenship extends itself also into the subversive forms of citizenship, not playing out in public, often for fear of reproach or deportation, where people simply live their lives, making neighborhoods, contributing their arts and culture and religious and food practices as gifts to the city. Second imaginary is the decoupling of state from nation. Herein lies the problem with citizenship, Mamdani says. He says, the relationship between state and nation produces a vicious cycle whereby the nation imagines the state as its protector, with the state only partially fulfilling its role. And the nation's investment in the state's bestowals of privilege intensifies, and in doing so, the state makes itself indispensable to the nation. It is a process whereby the nation or the people outsource their own agency to the state. And by the time the state usurped all the resources and power, the people unlearned how to be active citizens that own their own destinies. For Mamdani, it is crucial, therefore, to decouple state from nation. He writes, imagining political community beyond nation state is an urgent task. If Mamdani speaks of the urgency to imagine a new political community, the third imaginary, Bellum, Elaine Graham, and others spoke of the inauguration of such a new political community already in the formation of the new community of Jesus. Yet, the co-option of Christianity into empire has subverted the church not to be this new political community, but too often a puppet of the state. How can we allow the imagination of this new community, shaped in the cross, the resurrection, and the Pentecost, to rekindle a prophetic political imagination in South Africa today? For Willem, the new political community has to consider the millions of poor who are unemployed, he says, including those on state grants and the masses on service delivery strikes. If what we have is a pseudo-democracy, a new political community, Willem suggests, will ensure the participation of the very people currently excluded, as a reclamation of the police by the people, but now playing by the rules of the oikos. And then the imaginary of new movements of justice. Today, across the globe, new movements of solidarity engage in new forms of citizenry transcending colonial binaries. These movements are often intersectional, collaborative, rooted locally, connecting globally. Andrew Davies speaks of such social movements using the infrastructure of information technology to build solidarity, create visibility, and connect globally. These movements often disrupt the status quo, referred to by de Waal as the digital civil revolution, putting power digitally into the hands of citizens, which, of course, can be used to a variety of both good and evil purposes. Sociologist Manuel Castells writes, it is in these back alleys of society, whether in electronic or grassroots networks of communal resistance, that I have sensed the embryos of a new society. They represent reconfigured geographies of power, democracy, and citizenship, and the church can either join in or be left out. Elaine Graham, with reference to new urban social movements that adopt Lefebvre's right to the city as their rallying cry, speaks of them as alternatives to government's surrender to the dictates of capital. She writes, as the democratic decision-making powers of elected governments are in favor of the priorities of global capital, attention must be turned to urban citizens' ability to influence the political process as an antidote. The works of these movements is about claiming the collective right to the city. But, says David Harvey, it goes much deeper. The process of accessing a right to the city, he writes, is far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources. It is the right to change ourselves by changing the city. It is indeed the pursuit to become truly human. For me, that is what movements such as Reclaim the City or the Funau Kwazi in Cape Town, Abashlaribas in Jondolo in Durban, the Tshwane Waste Pickers Association, or the Water Heroes in Harry Smith help us understand. In a Biko sense, they long for, work for, and model true humanity. They recover own resources to honor both humans and the earth. In my mind, they give expression to the idea of becoming a household of freedom. When I speak of radix, I do so with reference to location, methodology, content, and possible impact. I locate radical citizenship, firstly, at the grassroots, where vulnerable people are unheard. Ordinary people practice agency. New movements are shaped, connecting synergetically with other local movements. Davies says radical citizenship can only be fostered in the praxis of communities and movements who refuse to let existing arrangements persist or the interests of the few shape the future. Methodologically, I offer an adapted praxis cycle intentional about citizenship that is embodied, discerning, resistant, imaginative, and constructive. Embodied citizenship is practiced through presence and solidarity. Embodied citizenship cannot be fostered by disembodied theologies. It requires theologies of radically embodied citizenship, preceded by a theology, a politics, a practice of presence. For Andrew Davey, the faith of the church is supposed to be lived, in his words, through presence, through communities that include, strengthen, and give integrity to those at the margin. Too often, our theologies and pastoral praxis are detached from the cries of the margins. Even more, we ourselves participate culturally in fostering suspicion, dismissal, and criminalization of those excluded ones who might hold the keys to a prophetic alternative. Discerning citizenship is listening, analytical, and deconstructive, continuously deconstructing not only the legacies of colonialism, apartheid, and other oppressive constructs in ourselves and our institutions, but equally rigorously naming the failure of most municipalities in South Africa to govern in clean, effective, and efficient ways with the effects it has on all of us, but specifically on the poor. Just as we wonder where President Ramaphosa was when corruption was at its deepest point, so too should we wonder where the church, her prophets, indeed, where all of us have been. In Ezekiel, God looked for somebody to stand in the gap, but found none. 394 in South Africa, God found some willing to stand in the gap, those theologian priests who absorbed the pain and anger of communities, discerned God's word in a time such as this, engaged in prophetic actions to dismantle apartheid. But it's a myth to think it was the majority. In fact, it was probably always a small remnant of people willing to absorb the collective cry of the people. There were millions who cried for change, but they worked in factories and mines as domestic workers and builders and could not engage at the forefront of the struggle. But their collective cry was heard, their burden carried. Who today absorbs the collective cry and anger of the poor? Already 7 years ago, Willem spoke of the anti-democratic practices that crept into former liberation movements and said, the task of unveiling anti-democratic practices is urgent. Who heeded his call? He writes, the narratives of the poor black masses, their experience of life in millions of Mpuku, provide the necessary compulsion for us to foretell through critical analysis. Discerning citizenship can only emerge from solidarity. Andrew Davey says it's solidarity that births critique or prophecy. And that is not something theoretical, but concrete collaboration in the trenches, expressed through living in community, says Moltmann, united with those experiencing being oppressed. Embodied theologies are able to discern well, and discerning theologies can birth resistant communities of faith. Resistant citizenship is both disruptive and subversive. Martha Ecclesberg, reflecting on the US, and Jenny Pierce on Latin America, consider resistant citizenship that they find in non-traditional forms of community activism. Ecclesberg, for example, says there's very low forms of mainstream political participation today in the US, but she finds in the margins of political life new forms of citizenship, resisting exclusion and co-option and demonstrating new possibility. Resistant citizenship can at once be both disruptive, subversive, and constructive. Whereas disruption constitutes a decisive break at once, as Jesus did when he exorcised the temple, subversion looks more like salt and yeast, infiltrating spaces from below, shrewd as serpents and gentle as doves. Disruptive citizenship takes different forms, expressed in digital organizing, self-governance from below, housing occupations, the Me Too, Black Lives Matter, or Fees Must Fall movement. Subversive citizenship is how we act as participants of institutions or the city we are in ways that subvert document practices, finding cracks in dominant stories, living a different practice from within. In subversive citizens, Barnes and Pryor show how public policies in the UK gets reinterpreted to be more official to those using the policies through the simple acts of ordinary people benefiting from the policies, or the staff implementing policies, living the policy into a different way of being. Disruption or subversion as strategies for change making do not have to be destructive. In fact, they are often less destructive than the pseudo-democratic processes masquerading responsible forms of citizenship whilst violating the majority of South Africa's poor and those without legal documents. Disruption and subversion can contribute to the constructive makeover of society in ways that represent radical forms of inclusivity, equity, and socio-spatial justice, if only we had eyes to see and ears to hear. Imaginative citizenship is both creative and innovative. Some of the new movements of activists are hugely innovative. The Funa Ukwazi and Reclaim the City in Cape Town have imaginative campaigns, often fueled with humor, the jester at play. In the 90s, Krizanak wrote a book titled Angry, Bored, Confused. We might be angry or confused at our politics, but liberal democracies often turn citizenship into boring enterprises, ticking boxes, complying with regulations, disallowing the innovative agencies of ordinary people to remake society in ways that work well for them. Whether it's the cultural activists among young people in cities all across South Africa, or the Sissy Ghoul House in Woodstock, Cape Town, disruptive, subversive, imaginative example of poor people who lost their housing in Woodstock as a result of gentrification and then occupied the old Woodstock Hospital, turning it into a self-organized housing project. Subversive alternative to exclusivist housing patterns in the mother city, which is often not a mother. Both Mamdani and Vellum speak of the urgency of a new political imagination. If not the apartheid city imaginary that still enslaves us, then we look at Dubai or Kigali or the smart cities of the global north, failing to learn from the imaginative forms of citizenship born from the cries of lament in local slums and neighborhoods across the country and continent. And then constructive citizenship, about liberation, transformation in a concrete sense, translating imaginaries into viable practices, building prototypes of that which we advocate for, constructing alternatives that can be measured in how it tangibly contributes to the freedom people long for, whether it is access to clean water, toilets, housing, or legal resource. It rethinks how we resource the wild dreams we have. Over the past few years, I've started personally to struggle with the idea of activism or research that are not aligned to actual measurable forms of change. Because if not, the question begs, do we believe any of what we fight for will ever happen? As theologian Daniel Palario suggests, the poor cannot eat our theologies. Let me change gears. Vellum held that the project of liberation, radical citizenship in this case, cannot be sustained without depths of spirituality. The largeness of the giants, the cruelness of capital, the shrewdness of politicians, the apathy of a people are such that we need deep wells to drink from. I propose that radical citizenship finds its grounding in solidarity with the cross and with cross-bearers, whilst refusing the cross as the final moment, because as a people of the resurrection, we look from beyond the cross. We participate in Moltmann's festal protest against death, or Wellum's rebellion against death in every form, against all that mitigate against people's full inclusion in the city. And we are propelled into such solidarity and festal rebellious protest by what Vuyani called the imvuselelo, the revival of the spirit, which is not just making us into a spiritual community, says Vellum, but the imvuselelo is the arche, the beginning of a new political community, the beginning of a household of freedom, of a citizenry that subverts the old and constructs the new. Again, Moltmann speaks of Pentecost, or Wellum's imvuselelo, as the assertion that there is enough for everyone. It is this new political community that declare daily, in private and public, in how we practice citizenship, engage the power, share resources, that there is enough for everyone. Radical citizenship stands in solidarity with the cross-bearer outside the city's gate. Participate in a festal protest of rebellion against the systems that keep some outside the gate. And do so enthused by the spirit of Pentecost, shaping us into a community, insisting that there's enough for everyone, therefore opening up every gate. Where do we find signs of this community? Perhaps we should take our clues or cues from non-citizen citizens, from landless movements, from waste pickers, now called reclaimers. And oh, they reclaim so much more than our garbage. They reclaim their lives, space, their right to be in the city, their agency. They reclaim the right of a people to make the city in a way that remakes ourselves into true humans. When all else fails, I often go back to the work of Walter Brueggemann, who reads Micah 6 through the lens of the post-liberation people of God, freed from oppression, yet now the oppressor. And God takes them up on this in the form of a court case to confront the unfreedoms this post-oppression people dealt their neighbors. They responded to God by trying to manipulate, and of course God did not fall for it and asks of them to do only three things: to walk humbly with God, to love mercy and kindness, and to act justly. Brueggemann speaks of this as the necessity for a threefold conversion: to God, to our neighbor, and to the police. Firstly, a call to walk humbly with God as disciples of Jesus, a call to discipleship. How central is discipleship in our enterprise as practical theologians in institutions of theological education? Or is even speaking of Jesus sometimes seen as uncool? Moltmann, in reflecting on the horrors of Germany, reflect on the consequences of discipleship, but also of non-discipleship, stating the consequences of non-discipleship, of truth repudiated, justice shattered, humanity betrayed, are catastrophic. He says, and I quote him, "If I deny the truth, I permit injustice. If I take no notice of the people being persecuted, my family and I will get along the better for it, but the torments of hell begin at the same time, the torments of a broken backbone and unforgivable guilt." He might refer to the Jews. We can refer to the migrants, the homeless, the trafficked child, the ways in which municipal police across South Africa daily bully landless people and informal traders. Our disembodied distances from their realities make us not know their truth, which is the convenience of a detached theology that denies truth and then becomes an act of non-discipleship. In proximity, the truth will be clear. Solidarity, our call; justice, our vocation. And we will learn the work of radical citizenship, which is to grow backbone and share our lives as neighbors and citizens freely in the new household of God. The second call, to love mercy, is the call to our neighbor, the call to a practice of neighborliness. When we look in the face of God, we see the stranger, the poor, the waiting God. Brueggemann translates this phrase, suggesting we are called to love tenderly, tenaciously, gently, but without giving up. Who is our neighbor? When we consider the Christians in Palestine, the Muslims killed in Myanmar, our sisters and brothers in South Sudan or Ethiopia, those living without electricity or water in inner city high-rises, who is our neighbor? And we soon become aware that their suffering is often the result of political, economic, and other forms of systematic oppression and exclusion, which calls us thirdly then to act justly, calling us into the police, into the practice of citizenship, to engage those systems and powers that make the city. As communities of faith, our citizenship should flow from an understanding of discipleship and our encounter with the one who came to dwell among us as our neighbor. And in doing so, subverted the religious and political dictates of his day, practicing a citizenship not of this world, but in this world, allowing the oikos to disrupt the police. Call to walk humbly and love tenderly, tenaciously, and act justly. Raymond Lowe speak about the theological tension over the centuries between discipleship and citizenship, which should be prioritized, the tension between loving God or loving the city. But Augustine rejected the idea of such a tension, as redemption meant the restoration of all our relationships to God, to neighbor, to city, to earth. And therefore, we have to transcend with our faith practices and lives all the false tensions that has little bearing on the crucified life of Christ, publicly shared in solidarity. Discipleship, neighborliness, and citizenship belong together in a very intimate way, whereas discipleship grounds us ecclesially and citizenship focuses us publicly, neighborliness roots us incarnationally. Moltmann speaks of the perils of non-discipleship. I'd like to broaden it to suggest that non-discipleship, non-neighborliness, and non-citizenship present an imminent threat to the existence of creation, humanity, and our cities and towns as we know it. Without prophetic priestly discipleship, neighborliness and citizenship, neighborhoods fall apart, infrastructure crumble, resources be squandered, relationships destroyed, the earth at risk. It starts in Harry Smith or Ikageng or Sandton, but it's also global. In our little Center for Faith and Community at Pretoria University, we host something called the Urban Studio, a project that connects to 6 urban sites in the city of Tshwane. In each of these contested sites, citizens practice agency against many odds. In these spaces, we discern signs of the new household at work, frail, tentative shoots that with the right nurture might become trees and forests. In one site, informal dwellers resisted forced removals for 15 years, and 17 court cases later, they remain living opposite the most expensive golf estate in the city. In another, mostly women formed a housing association advocating for the rights of backyard dwellers. In a third site, we engaged with 20 community-based organizations that span a web of care over their neighborhoods, offering services ranging from childcare, elderly care, and disability care, practicing radical forms of citizenship, the glue holding that place together. But those doing what they do in these sites don't necessarily speak of it as citizenship. They simply do what they do because they know they need to do it to sustain life. Institutions in some of these sites learn about becoming neighbors and citizens beyond narrow self-interest. Those of us at the university slowly discover the possible meaning of academic citizenship, researcher solidarity, scholar activism, or research for social justice. Edgar Pieterse from the African Center for Cities in Cape Town dreams of citizens' academies where citizens, ordinary people in neighborhoods, academics, and others collaborate to find solutions for Cape Town's problems. The Urban Studio, likewise, are urban classrooms or citizens' academies in which we try to act, reflect, dialogue, and research as a collaborative form of citizenship. Let me try to offer tentative conclusions. Of course, there are some challenges with this notion. Citizens' interventions can get the state off the hook in terms of its legal, political, moral, fiduciary obligations. While citizens can reverse Harry Smith, such interventions could allow the state to permanently negate its duty. The power of the state in collusion with capital often render citizens' actions weak or obsolete, neutralizing gains made through making investments in the status quo which citizen movements cannot compete with. It always seems to be a prophetic remnant standing in the gap, trying to subvert the status quo whilst the convenience of absence gets chosen by the majority. Self-management practices such as water purification contain within them grave risks if they continue unregulated. And so these challenges should be incorporated into the imaginaries of a household of freedom. The household of freedom is characterized, in my mind, by being a new spiritual and political community, transcending boundaries of nation-state, native, settler, citizen, non-citizen. Active participation of non-citizen and legal citizens as fully human image bearers of God, respecting difference, holding multiplicity of citizenships and identities hospitably, expressed in new intersectional, interconnected global movements of change. As the new household of freedom, the new global community of Jesus, citizenship, I Submit should be understood as continuous eruptions from below, subverting the rule and domination of the police, opening up spaces for both humanity and creation to flourish. Finally, radical citizenship will not confine us to our churches and institutions, our streets or neighborhoods, to policy work in municipalities or even in national platforms. It will require of us to be present somehow as a body in all those spaces and beyond. Radical citizenship will not only struggle with those out there in places outside the city's gate, but will also confront our own complicity in here as families, faith communities, theological institutions, in universities, perpetuating that which excludes or oppresses ever so subtly. Grounded in a praxis of local communities and movements, but connected globally, we will not only absorb the trauma of hard lockdown and isolation of those who are rendered invisible in our cities through embodied citizenships of solidarity and healing. But when we hear that, and I risk saying only 5.7 million people so far died to COVID-19 since 2020, whilst just in 2019 alone, 7.5 million children died of preventable diseases across the world that will take a fraction of money to prevent, but mostly in the global south. That too should prompt us into radical actions of global solidarity. But of course, we could start by addressing the youth crisis that we spoke about in a panel yesterday. God, as housekeeper of the global household, calls us to participate through compassionate discipleship, tender, tenacious neighborliness, and courageous, just citizenship to mend what is broken wherever we find ourselves and wherever we are prompted to be. Thank you.
Wow, that's what one can say. Thank you so much, Stephanie. You never disappoint, as usual. The amazing ability and skill to bring into synergy real practice of the inner city, trying to develop and transform the inner city. As a practice, but also with the academy to reflect on this as an academic. Thank you so much. This has really been quite helpful and insightful. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Yes, we've got questions already coming here that would like to share with you. But maybe as a way of starting again, I'll kickstart the questions. Brilliant stuff. What I missed with all those great insights and ideas was, where does the church fit in? We are concerned with practical theology. We are concerned with the practice of the church, wanting to reflect on how it communicates itself, its belief, its practice to society and all that. So with all these wonderful ideas and what is going on and what we need to be doing, can you also reflect a little bit about the church? Where is it here? Is it remaining aloof and distant? Is there anything new that we need to do to bring the church on board? My thinking seated down there, but that's just one question from me. I'm not sure if you do. Are you able to see the other questions that are on the screen, or you want me to read that? But I think I'm hoping you can read that. Maybe you can just respond to me and then to that one, and then we can give to the floor after that. Okay.
Thanks, Samanga. I see one or two comments. They're not necessarily questions. So maybe after I responded, I don't know if you would want to read the comments from Smith and from Christo. But in response, so maybe to start by confessing that sometimes I'm probably too have become a bit cynical about the church. Just this week, somebody shared what Pope Francis was saying. He said, I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it's been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and clinging to its own security. I think the challenge for the church, Samanga and others, is that the church also has choices to make. And I think sometimes we choose to cling to our security. Yesterday in the presentation about Bloemfontein City Centre, I mean, it was very clear. The churches relocated themselves since the 80s from tough places and still do it too often. But I would want to suggest very practically, so the adapted praxis cycle, I would suggest as something that local faith communities and churches should engage in. In my local context, in my local neighborhood, where do we want to practice solidarity? How do we read our local communities? How do we discern in our preaching and in our liturgies how God wants us to engage? What are the kinds of deaths in our local context, whether it's townships or suburbs or informal settlements, that we need to resist? How do we imagine signs of God's goodness in the places that we are in? How do we mobilize our resources into that? And how do we then also construct it? So for me, very practically, I might have drawn from examples and imaginaries besides for Vellum and Elaine Graham that has not always been clearly church, but I would want to suggest that local churches should consider engaging in such a praxis-based approach, where we learn how to do our faith in embodied ways that will discern, that will resist, that will imagine, that will construct. And so I don't want also to give, I think the challenge often with intellectual work and liberation theologies, and Willem also said that at some point, is that we get stuck in analysis and even then in imagination, but we very seldom build prototypes of that which we talk about. And I think part of the challenge for the church is also that. How can we actually create signs of the newness that came in Jesus? And how do we do it today in context of so much challenge in South Africa?
Thank you so much, colleagues. Yes, yeah. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time, then we'll continue. Okay. I see Nas there. Let's take Nas's question first, and then. Oh yeah, for our audience, yeah, for those who are out there. Anyone else wants to ask a question or comment can be walking to the front anyway, so that we can do that without any problems. Yes, feel free to quietly walk to the front.
Yes, Stephan, I want to link up with the question of Simanga about the church. I think one should perhaps speak in the plural of churches, that the church is such a plural, diverse phenomenon. And within this diversity, you speak of church in the ideal. What would be the ideal church? But do you see some potential somewhere? Can one identify that as perhaps something to link up with, and not only as the church, the ideal church, but where are there signs of an alternative church?
Thank you, Nas. Yes, firstly, I think I would want to say that Christ, of course, is not confined to the church institutionally as we define it narrowly. So I would want to see signs of church. We recently had a conference where people from Mandela's movement speak up. And when we spoke to them, we realized almost all of them, we thought they will just come for their speaking engagement and leave. But they all were people of faith that grew up in churches and felt at some point that the church didn't give them space, didn't understand their activism, And so there's still people of faith doing what they're doing actually as part of their vocation, but not necessarily embraced by the church. So that's also a challenge, I think. But let me come back to your question. I think signs of from Towers of Hope in the middle of Bloemfontein to what Jeanette Sabanda and her colleagues do in Khayelitsha with vegetable gardens and with the kind of things they did during COVID-19 through the garbage churches of Ben Beltran and Daniel Pilario in places like Manila that literally transformed garbage communities of 30,000 people into viable housing complexes and neighborhoods that have all kinds of eco things going. Across the world, in the global north and south, there are amazing examples. And I think we should perhaps identify those and write them up and amplify those. Because, you see, they are often born, I think, in places of great suffering and death, where the Spirit then moves people to think in innovative ways out of the box, and where, in a very concrete sense, even resurrections happen. And so those examples are there all over us. And I think part of our work, and maybe I haven't retrieved them much in what I presented, but I think that we should be doing. We should retrieve those examples as well. During COVID, during hard lockdown in Tshwane, we were surprised at which churches responded to the crisis of homelessness and which not. One case was a church in the gated community, a Dutch Reformed church, to the great disgust of the neighborhood watch and everybody else. They welcomed homeless people in their church as a temporary shelter. Then there's a church that we will think of as a prosperity church that opened their place for 80 homeless people in the church, and they still house them. So we should also be open for surprise, that in surprising places and ways, the church emerges. The church that connects to the suffering Christ. Let me leave it at that.
Any other input, colleagues? Yes, thank you so much. Whilst Gordon and Nico are coming forward, I just want to be saying this, Stephan, which is quite interesting for me. I belong to some small group that has been complaining and whining about the church being absent in its presence in South Africa today, with all the challenges that we are facing and all that. And they sent me with a message, because some message had leaked of what might happen following the July lootings. And so they said, something has leaked, some people are planning something. Can you go and talk to the General Secretary of the SACC to actually intervene here as SACC so that we stop this thing once and for all? And when I spoke to the General Secretary, he simply said, man, the church is so fragmented in this country that each small group are doing their small thing in some corner somewhere. And the systems and the challenges that we are faced are so huge that while small things are happening and are good in different corners, they're not actually making a dent to the types of problems that we face as a nation. And so even we as SACC don't even know where to start, because we are not being supported by churches. Churches are just doing their little things in their corners and all that. And so we'll never turn the tide on these issues. And so I'm just wondering, just to think about that as you are responding to our colleagues here, that this, how do we help the church as theologians so that instead maybe of us talking amongst ourselves and having these great insights and all that, and picking up the ideas that are happening in margins and corners and celebrating that, but being able to help the church to mobilize all those things to the mainstream so that there is real push and response, disruption, discerning, and all those good things that you say. Just to think about that, because we are such a fragmented church. Thank you. come forward and then they go after you.
So Manga, can I just say, and I want to link up with what you spoke about on Wednesday when that took us back to the Kairos document. Yeah. I think we're at that place again and it's new. It's not the same people that are aligned to. So we're back in a place, I think, where we practice state theologies and church theologies, and I want to come from I'm biased, and I want to come from a place of asking, where is the prophetic church? And if some of the traditional platforms that represented that are not able to do that anymore, we probably need to animate new formations that will look quite different. And it won't always come from above. Christopher Baker in the US makes a distinction between what he calls arborescent and rhizomatic urban theology. So some are theologies coming from above, and then there are all those things that jump up from below in a postmodern world. And I think we need to have an eye for that and think, how do we connect those prophetic things happening, often in silos, to animate new movements? But it will take a lot of energy. And yet I don't think we have a choice so how do we collectively read where we are now? Are we not in a different kind of kairos? And what is it that we need to respond to?
Yeah, I think what I want to ask or say relates to what you have just said in your question too. I was just wondering whether, whether the question should not be what church, what type of church are we talking about? Stephan, you referred in your concept earlier to the state. Is there not a correlation between the church we talk about, between inverted commas, and the state that you have so brilliantly discussed earlier? What I'm getting at is the Christendom paradigm, the institutionalized church, as you have just noted, busy in their own corners with their own business and so forth. Is the church not where the 2 or 3 gathers in his name or in his action to embody exactly what you have discussed so far? Are we not captured by the notion of being church that we lose sight of the constructive actions of the church on the streets, where just 2 or 1 are actively engaging? Perhaps we are also captured in our thinking.
Thank you, Stephan. I'm tempted now just to make a comment in terms of, I think if we move back from a practical theology back to the Trinitarian theology, that might help us to reclaim again the Missio Dei, to see where God is working in society. So I would disagree a little bit with Bishop Malusi at the SACC to say that I think in a way that's where God is working, is maybe in the fragmentation of society, and the church is there, small. Gordon, I agree with you in terms of 1 or 2 where they are gathering, they're also doing. So maybe we should reclaim that and see something of the Missio Dei. And from a practical theology, maybe that should be the point of departure, to say we work with Trinitarian theology, God working, inviting us where he is busy. Stephan, my question is in terms of the word reclaim. I pick that up a lot, even in my conversations, and with Delharp, and I work in Bloemfontein, which you mentioned. There's a perspective that we need to reclaim communities, and I'm a little bit cautious because the moment we use the word reclaim, it transcends to who is using the word.
Because if a certain community uses the word reclaim, they want to bring it back to where it was when they were in control. Is that the right terminology to use? Isn't there another word which we can start using? Regenerate. I don't have anything about it, but I'm very cautious about the word reclaim.
Thank you. Those are all good comments. I think they speak for themselves. I don't have to respond much, but you're right. Who speaks of, who uses reclaim for what purposes? Is it speaking of a loss of what was, and even of privilege? What do we mean? So I think I take that. I also agree with you that perhaps, as Melan wrote about, Christ in the cracks. And in the fragmentation. And I think, yeah, so maybe we don't even know in how far we've been captured on the one hand. And there's a whole maybe deconstruction. And I think it is in new movements and eruptions from below that we see signs. I mean, I sometimes get into communities where faith is not at the forefront, but when you start to see how they practice life together, it feels like the Acts community. The depths of sharing and the vitality of faith puts one to shame. And then it is in communities of real struggle. And I find something of Christ in those spaces. Yeah. So how do we reimagine our own place at the moment? And it cannot look, and I think the other thing, just, and then I'll be quiet, is that I think many of us, of course, are tired. And so who are the young voices in their 20s and 30s that are not necessarily having the imaginaries of church and the romanticized imaginaries also of the struggle church, who can help us as we try to find a new prophetic voice in South Africa today. Maybe we who speak to each other here are mostly representing another generation, and where are the voices of those others? I think that is also quite important.
Thank you so much. Anybody else who still wants to come forward? Do we have the questions here? I wonder if you can see them as Stephanie. One from Crystal Lombard there, and then Smith, Teddy. Yeah. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Good. Let's go for it.
Yeah. I mean, Christo is commenting just about, I think, the dangers of idealist visions, and then he speaks of how it turned out in certain practices, such as apartheid, Nazism, communism. I think the imaginaries that Russell and Bellum and Mamdani and all of them offer are exactly not these binaries of we want to replace this with that. But it's something quite different. The new community in Christ is something quite different that refuses to play the same game of all these big constructs. And we have to figure out what that will mean in local communities and in kind of intersectional movements and networks that disrupt and so forth. So Christo, I mean, those are interesting comments, and I think we need to discuss them more. Are we wanting to replace one, like the apartheid imaginary, with a different kind? I mean, of course, the problem in South Africa is, and Amira Osman, the architect, says we haven't yet found an imaginary powerful enough to replace the apartheid city imaginary in its simplicity and so on. But what will an imaginary be that's life-giving? And I think that's the question. And I think that's behind your question as well. The danger of idealisms that will then create new kinds of oppressions. I think that's what happens in Micah as well. So is what we're imagining life-giving? Is it constituting new forms of sharing? Is it affirming the small and the other and so forth? And if it is not, it is as evil. But that is why we have to, as theologians, be so active the whole time in discerning and deconstructing and being communities of resistance that will resist the new and subtle forms of oppression that appear. And I think that is where what Moltmann speaks about non-discipleship can be so helpful. But that cannot happen if we're not in close solidarity with where the suffering happens, I think. That's where critique and prophecy is born. But those are some thoughts. I mean, this is a whole discussion that, Christo, that you open up there, and I think there's a need to speak about that more with each other.
Thank you so much, colleagues. I would like us to give Stephanie a rousing applause.